morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to talk about a subject that I agree is extremely important, the United Nations. It was established back in 1945 following World War II as a way to promote a dialogue for the purpose of securing international peace. Although the United Nations consists of 191 member nations today, its primary goal of establishing peace around the globe is far from over, and it is far from exemplary. I do not wish to revisit the entire history of the UN this morning, but I would like to speak a little bit about some very, very important topics. Now, I am going to say some critical things about the UN, but before I do that, I need to acknowledge that there are some good things that the UN is capable of doing. One of them, I think, is the UN World Food Program. It has distributed millions of tons of food to starving people. The U.S. has contributed almost half of this food aid to the World Food Program around the world. Humanitarian aid is one of the most positive functions of the UN. It has provided relief in war-torn countries in Africa and is providing needed aid in Iraq. While this is a positive feature of the UN, it does so by having the U.S. give much of this food to those in need, and the goodwill is accrued to the UN and frequently not to the American people, who are providing often more than half of the food aid. The UN has provided an international effort to monitor nuclear weapons proliferation. The UN International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, has increasingly played an important role in monitoring nuclear weapons programs. They have discovered traces of nuclear material in Iran and have given Iran a deadline, actually of October 31st, coming up soon, timely for this symposium. The treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is what they're trying to enforce with Iran. While the UN has done this with Iran, as with Iraq, it is unlikely that the UN will be able to do anything more than issue press releases against Iran, against proliferation, condemning them, and likewise in the case of North Korea, the IAEA essentially has been ineffective. It has no capability of implementing its directives. Now, unfortunately, the UN's track record with Iraq demonstrates, I think, much more clearly the inability of the UN to exercise any of its will. One of the fundamental problems with the UN is not so much the idea of an international body directed to foster dialogue or to enhance international peace, but rather, as it is currently organized, the UN consists of member nations with very conflicting ideologies and goals. Although the UN Millennium Declaration stated that democratic governments provided the best protection for humanitarian rights, democracy is not a requirement for UN membership. The UN consists of states that are of great variance with one another, from democracies to military dictatorships, from communist governments to monarchies. It is almost inconceivable that the aims of these disparate governments, some of them are desperate as well, can be unified. Too often the UN has become a body whereby serious global powers such as China and the former USSR seek to enhance their power and influence at the expense of freedom-loving nations and freedom-loving people, frequently freedom-loving people within their own borders. This great divergence of aims and goals leads to the inability to provide real substance behind its resolutions. Those states with no regard for democracy or law continue to ignore UN resolutions and mandates aimed at promoting peace. In short, law-abiding states are inclined to live by the international agreements reached, while rogue nations continue to act as though no agreements were ever signed. Because of these disparate pressures, there are serious problems furthering the goals of peace and liberty. Here are a few examples whereby UN entities operating in other countries have no regard for UN resolutions or restrictions placed on contributions to those entities. Let us look at the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA. The UNFPA has provided millions of dollars for family planning services around the world. However, the UNFPA has been involved in coercive population control programs in Vietnam. It supports coercive sterilization programs in Peru and supports the one-child family planning policies, including forced abortions, in China. China administers one of the most repressive population control programs by severely penalizing women who violate the one-child policy, and they engage in coercive abortion. Another example of the UN's failure has been with regard to the Palestinians through the UN Relief and Work Agency, or UNRWA. Established in 1949 to offer humanitarian aid to the Palestinian refugees, it has spent billions of dollars over the years supplying food, water, and education to the Palestinians, but has done little more than maintain them in their refugee status for the last 50 years. The United States contributes nearly $100 million a year to this UNRWA. The problem with UNRWA is that it has created a virtual welfare state. Instead of bringing greater economic and personal freedom to the Palestinians, it has created a culture of dependency and serves as a breeding ground for terrorist organizations with the goal of destroying Israel and fostering of international terrorism. Furthermore, the fact that this $100 million a year in U.S. aid is administered through the UN, it deprives the U.S. of the opportunity to develop any type of leverage with the Palestinian people and encourage and engender goodwill towards the United States. Another very troubling development was the decision by the UN to place Libya, yes, Libya, on the UN Council for Human Rights. And I would not be surprised at all if some of the other speakers this morning are going to develop this issue further. And I must apologize if I'm stealing your speech, Tom.
It's not my job for rebuttal.
There's a lot of material here, and I'm afraid I may have chosen the juiciest items and gone first. The State Department lists Libya as a state sponsor of terrorism, and Amnesty International cites Libya for its humanitarian rights abuses, extrajudicial executions, and torture of political detainees. After kicking the U.S. off the UN Human Rights Commission in May of 2001, the UN placed Libya on the commission. Furthermore, in January of 2003, Libya was elected to chair the UN Council for Human Rights, and the international community expects this body to monitor human rights around the world. Furthermore, the UN offers a cloak of legitimacy for racism. In July 2001, the UN sponsored a conference supposedly on human rights in Durban, South Africa. The conference was to address racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Instead of condemning racism, it provided a platform for anti-Semitism by declaring Zionism is racism. The U.S. fortunately walked out on this event. And what the UN Security Council, which is the most important UN body to work towards global peace, what of it? The Council consists of 5 permanent member nations, the U.S., Russia, China, France, and Britain. It also consists of 10 rotating members. On October 8th of 2001, Syria, a state sponsor of terrorism, was elected to serve on the U.S. Security Council. It was elected to the Security Council despite the fact that Syria is an active sponsor of terrorism, occupies Lebanon, it's believed to have stockpiled chemical and biological weapons, and continues a threatening posture towards Israel. Furthermore, Syria continues to allow terrorists to operate from its territory to target coalition forces in Iraq, yet it casts a crucial vote in UN Security Council meetings. However, though the Security Council has passed resolutions condemning terrorism, and it passed 16 resolutions against Saddam's regime, it has proven woefully inept at enforcing its resolutions. In September of last year, President Bush addressed the UN General Assembly in order to urge that it pass a resolution to hold Saddam's feet to the fire. President Bush challenged the UN to enforce its own resolutions against Iraq, which had been thwarted since the end of the first Gulf War. Mr. Bush asked, will the United Nations serve the purpose of its founding, or will it be irrelevant? Unfortunately, it is not merely rogue nations like Syria who present a problem. The resolution that passed promised serious consequences if Iraq failed to live up to its obligations in Resolution 1441. Germany, Russia, and most notably France made an active effort to prevent the serious consequences against Iraq that were called for in Resolution 1441. As it turned out, the resolution had tough rhetoric, but the UN was unable to sanction any action against Iraq for failing to fulfill its obligations under the resolution. Countries with strategic differences at variance with the United States can and often do act to thwart American national security interests, even when facing the brutality of an Iraqi regime that murdered thousands of its own people and was condemned universally. So now what? Now what do we do? The President has gone back to the UN to offer it an increasing role in rebuilding Iraq. It has proposed giving the UN a, quote, vital role, which would give it a greater role in the political and humanitarian process. However, those who opposed the war are now calling for an even greater UN level of control, an almost immediate transfer of control to the Iraqi governing authority. This is ironic given the fact that the UN has been in control of Kosovo since 1998 with no plans to hand over control to the people there. I believe we must stay the course in Iraq. The UN can and should play a supportive role as it has been, but we must remember that just 10 months ago this same body chose not to act against this brutal regime, and there will be no assurances that the UN would be supportive of efforts to help the Iraqi people build a democracy in the middle of the Islamic world of the Middle East. So what is the role of Congress? The questions that I am raising this morning bring up a lot of important points, and what can we do in the Congress of the United States? Well, I think there are several things that we can do. One of them is related to funding. I have voted to reduce the U.S. taxpayer funding to the United Nations. In nearly every Congress, there is an amendment to offer to end U.S. funding to the UN. Usually, about 70 members vote for this. Several years ago, I worked to support efforts, along with Senator Helms of North Carolina and others, to reduce U.S. contributions to the UN. Those efforts were successful, and we reduced U.S. contributions to the UN to not more than 22% of the total UN budget. In my opinion, if the vast majority of nations in the United Nations are going to take a decidedly anti-U.S. posture, it is inappropriate for us to fund an increasingly larger percentage of its operations. I believe that we need to build on this effort in the years ahead. There are many international humanitarian efforts that the U.S. undertakes, and I believe in most instances it is the bilateral programs where the U.S. and the recipient is giving the money directly to the recipient country and not funneling it through the UN is the better way to go, and we need to take more of a posture on that in the years ahead. During recent consideration of the Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill this July, we were able to secure 187 votes in the House of Representatives to limit U.S. contributions to the UN to not more than $100 million, the amount paid by the second largest contributor to the UN. I think this is a step in the right direction and can lead us to the place where I believe we need to be in the years ahead. Now, one question which may come up is, should the United States pull out of the UN completely, a position that some people I know hold very dearly. We have a bill, H.R. 1146, which would entirely remove the United States from the UN. I have not supported this bill, and I have not voted for doing this. One of my major concerns here is that total withdrawal from the United Nations would remove us from the UN Security Council, a place where we have been able to veto some very decidedly bad and very decidedly anti-American U.S. proposals in the years past. In summary, while I have serious reservations about the United Nations and the way it functions, I do believe that the United States needs to remain engaged. We need to continue to be a member, and we need to continue to hold on to our seat on the Security Council. I think we should seriously look at reducing funding and reforming many of the internal processes of the United Nations, and in particular, we need to address the decidedly anti-American, anti-democratic, and anti-human rights postures that that body has assumed in recent years. Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Congressman Weldon. Now we'll hear from Congressman Tom Feeney.
Well, I'm glad to be back. 2 straight occasions on your first and second days at the Institute, Lou, and we really appreciate what you're doing. Nothing was more topical than discussions of the Patriot Act and civil liberties, and nothing could be more topical right now than the role of the UN and specifically the United States in the UN. If you wanted somebody to respond today with a resounding defense of the United Nations, you're going to be sadly disappointed, at least for the next 10 minutes or so. But I will say in its defense that the UN has, in some ways, an impossible utopian mission. I mean, if you are asked as a global international body to provide peace and happiness for 8 billion diverse peoples throughout the world, it is a mission that, candidly, nobody is going to be able to live up to. And in their defense, they've been asked to do, in many cases, much too much. But having said that, I will tell you that Daniel Patrick Moynihan, no right-wing conservative Republican, he was a UN ambassador, he was a Democratic senator from New York, described the United Nations in 1978 as a very dangerous place for American interests. I would submit to you that, indeed, that's gotten dramatically worse in the last 25 years, and in some ways the UN is less important than ever. I think that Congressman Weldon points out that there are some significant roles that the UN can and often does play a very useful role. Humanitarian aid, for example. I think Dave outlined that with his medical background. I think he could talk about some of how important it is that you have an international body that's looked at as sort of a dispassionate arbiter to go in places and help save people who need food and medicine and shelter on an emergency basis, much like the Red Cross. Secondly, I would point out that it is useful, in my view, and Dave says we shouldn't entirely pull out of the UN. That may or may not be true. I'm not sure I've concluded that, but it is useful, in my view, to have a place on the planet where the leaders throughout the world can come talk. Having said that, in the sense of collective security, which was the ideal mission that the Allied powers, basically, who chartered the United Nations in the aftermath of World War II, it was basically Britain and the United States that got together and said, wouldn't it be nice if we had a collective organization to provide for the common defense and peace throughout the planet. Well, that mission is no more successful under UN leadership than it was under the League of Nations in preventing World War II. In my view, collective security, if you're an American, is no security at all. I would start with an important proposition, and that is some of us may have different goals for what we want to see U.S. foreign policy to be. If you want to achieve a one-world government, if you want instant world peace, if you want to alleviate hunger, those are all potentially very noble objectives, but that's not my objective as a congressman. I want to do what George Washington and John Adams and our founders would have done, which is to pursue American interests throughout the world, but especially in our region. Unfortunately, because of weapons capabilities and trade, the region is becoming the entire globe these days. A Monroe Doctrine is insufficient to provide for your national defense anymore, and let alone the commerce aspects. But my goal, first and foremost, is to protect and provide for the security of America and our interests around the globe. When it comes to collective security, when it comes to American defense in particular, but collective security in general, the UN has been a woeful failure. The Soviet Union, for the better part of the 50 years of the UN, it did withdraw for a while during the Korean War, I believe it was, but the Soviet Union has always had a veto power during the Cold War. So you had the United States and our allies, you had the Soviet Union, sometimes allied, sometimes not, with China, for example. Not only was the United Nations not the reason, that we didn't have all-out hostilities between America and our allies against communist Soviet Russia, but it was NATO that basically was the chief deterrent. It was basically countries that had interests binding together on an ad hoc and temporary basis to perform NATO. And we're discussing in Washington the role of NATO in America today, and I think that Mr. Schultz is going to be addressing you, who's a member of the German Bundestag for many years. But the actual purpose of NATO has withered as the Soviet Union has gone away. So another thing that we have to rethink as we look at our foreign policy in this new millennium is the role of NATO. Not only did the United Nations really not do much to help or alleviate in most cases, the battle in the Cold War, but even regional disputes, because Russia would have its allies and America would have its allies, in some ways became globalized. And the UN, while probably wasn't at fault for most of the situations where you took a regional conflict and globalized it, because we had allies on one side of a fight, Vietnam and Korea, for example, the Soviets or China had allies on the other. But the UN was just incapable of stopping these regional fights from potentially becoming global situations. Although, again, I would point out that getting people in a room and discussing things can be very, very important. The UN has been at times a horrible failure in peacekeeping. Dave talked about the success that they have had in humanitarian aid, and that is very true. But when it actually comes to peacekeeping, if you look back at 1993, for example, the horrible slaughter in Somalia, while the UN was present in Rwanda, things got even worse. The UN was basically the overseer at a time where the biggest genocide and the most obvious genocide since Hitler's Nazi Germany. Some 500,000 Tutsi members were slaughtered and butchered in front of not only the watchful eyes of the world, but the UN presence on the ground. And perhaps even more onerous is that in the breakup of Yugoslavia, where you had these different nation states created, all got sanctioned by the United Nations, the Serbians were busy executing Muslims in Bosnia, and the United Nations basically embargoed any weapons. Now, the UN Charter, among other things, just like our Second Amendment, guarantees countries the right to self-defense. But in effect, these people were butchered and slaughtered as they were asked to come to places that were considered to be safe harbors under UN protection. But the UN adopted a rule: if you were a UN soldier on the ground, you were not able to fire on anybody unless you were directly fired upon. And so we basically were umpires, the UN was, as we watched this horrible execution of many Muslims at the time. I'll tell you that the United Nations, in my view, is less relevant today than it's ever been because it is completely incapable with dealing with terrorists. Number one, terrorists don't belong to the UN. Even nations that harbor terrorists, and terrorism is the big threat on the globe today. One of the things I should point out is that, in my view, perhaps for the first time since the Roman Empire, there is one superpower on the globe. For 300 years, if you study Western Europe, there was basically a balance of power that operated between the 5 or 6 major nation states there, where if one group got too big, people would shift alliances so that they could stop anybody from being the bully on the block. That is no longer true. It is the United States that is the one global superpower, and while there are limitations to our capabilities, clearly, we should recognize that there is no counterbalancing power. We are all, as Colin Powell says, reluctant internationalists today. And one of the things I do want to suggest is that changing our relationship to the UN, or even an outright withdrawal, is hardly withdrawal from the international community. If you look at what we're doing in trade today, we are doing less in terms of world trade agreements, where hundreds or dozens of countries are involved, and we're doing a lot more bilateral trade agreements. We've given the President authority. You can do a lot of these things on a one-on-one basis. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the moral failures of the United Nations, because this is probably my biggest and largest criticism and the suggestion that I have in terms of why we need so desperately to rethink our position. As Senator Moynihan said back in 1978, the ideals of the UN as it is constituted today do not reflect American values. They do not reflect the things that our founding fathers believed in, and they don't reflect the things, candidly, that I believe in. I'll tell you that they've repeatedly condemned Israel, as Dave told you. They have passed resolutions that basically says Zionism is racism. If you happen to believe that the Israeli state is something worth protecting. Since 1914 in the Balfour Declaration, a lot of British leaders, including Churchill, I think most Americans support the right of Israel to exist. But if you believe that, at least on one occasion, you've been condemned as a racist. The UN is increasingly trying to take over some sovereign parts of our ability to self-govern. The International Criminal Court that would at times undermine things that we have in the Bill of Rights, like the fact that you can't be subject to trial twice for the same crime. And this is something we have to be very careful about. But I want to leave you with a few thoughts about the membership of the UN. The United Nations, in one respect, is very democratic, and in one respect is completely undemocratic. It's completely undemocratic because unlike our view here, or most of Western Europe, or Australia, or many other of the nations we consider to be free today, the United Nations is dominated by the Islamic Conference, 70 roughly Muslim-led nations. Only Turkey can be reasonably described as a democracy. It's the Arab League and the African Union. Almost none of these 100-plus countries can fairly be described as a classically liberal, not big government Ted Kennedy liberal, a classically liberal, free, individual rights-oriented democratic society. We are one of the few rare breeds in the UN, and the fact of the matter is that we get outvoted in the United Nations on an increasing basis because we have very disparate values. And unless you want to surrender the traditional American values or wait to persuade these other countries to adopt those values, I think you have to recognize this disparity. What the UN tends to do is to legitimize monarchs, non-democratic leaders, and in many cases, tyrants and dictators. Dave told you that in 2000, the United States got kicked off the Human Rights Commission. Countries like Sudan, of course, Syria is on the Security Commission, but Cuba just got added to the Human Rights Commission, even as it was arresting 70 prominent free journalists. Imagine if we didn't like in the American government some of the things that were being said on the evening news, and we just went in at wholesale and arrested people that were critical of our government. And yet it was added to the Human Rights Commission that America was excluded from. These countries, and I will say this, they often understand the way the UN works better than we do. Saddam Hussein understood fully that the United Nations was never going to follow up on the resolutions it had passed. He knew that the United Nations was not a threat, no matter how badly he acted or how much he ignored UN resolutions. I suspect the same is true with respect to Iran and North Korea, probably the two largest nuclear threats on the planet today. They do know that the United States may be serious. And the only two successful engagements that the United Nations has ever participated in liberation, Kuwait and Korea, were basically U.S.-led, and the U.S. would have done what we did anyway, with or without United Nations approval. And so talking about collective security or keeping the peace and the United Nations in the same breath, I think, is very unreasonable. Finally, I'll say, because I want to leave time for questions, there is a role for the United Nations, but I do believe that we should probably dramatically scale back our funding. I personally think that we should instruct our ambassador to the UN to participate in debates, but not to vote. And I leave you with this thought about democracy. Most of the world is not represented by classically liberal Democrats. They are represented by monarchs, by dictators, by tyrants. And there's no democracy that is being represented in the United Nations. These are people the United Nations legitimizes in undemocratic countries. But democracy does take place at the UN. Non-democratic tyrants who do not share our values have the majority of the votes. And this is an example of democracy that was once described as what happens when you allow democracy to decide what's for dinner, and 2 wolves and 1 lamb get to vote. Ladies and gentlemen, we can't allow ourselves to be outvoted out of our principles and the things that we believe in, let alone our national security. Thank you.
And now to all, just some brief comments, Congressman Frey, so we can have time for questions.
Thank you very much. Remember when I was in high school or college, somebody asked me about how my date was, and my answer was compared to who. And I think that's what I look at the United Nations as. You know, compared to who, compared to what. It's been there for a long time. It is certainly imperfect. It has got a lot to do and a long way to go. But as I sit and think, what other forum is there, I can't think of one. I certainly don't want to go back and try and recreate the UN or the League of Nations. And I also wonder about the United States, can we do it alone? Because that's really what you're looking at. Can we act unilaterally? We've done it, and we've done it relatively successfully, but despite the French and the problems that we have in the UN, would it be better for U.S. interests if we had the French at least helping us somewhat without giving the store away? Would it help if we had the European community helping us rather than giving the store away? I approach it from what's best for the United States. Tom, I never voted for a foreign aid bill. I voted for U.S. aid. I thought if there was a place where we could put money and it would help our country, then I'd do it. But that's the way I approached it philosophically. And I guess that's sort of the way I look at the UN. I think there's a lot of changes that need to be made in it, a lot of places to go. It's certainly at its low point, but I think it's worth trying to make it better. And hopefully out of the conference today, and we'll hear from the European view, we'll hear from others, that we'll get a really broad look of this whole issue, and if there is a chance to make it better. Maybe there isn't. I don't know. I would certainly put Dave and Tom down as not undecided, as they never are. We really appreciate your remarks. Thank you very much.
Okay, our panelists would be happy to answer questions for you. If you go to the mic and ask one, we'll be happy to propose it to them.
About a year and a half ago, I traveled to China to try and have a dialogue with the government there about their persecution of Falun Gong, meditation practice. The police arrested me at night, and I suffered really severe torture at the hands of the Chinese government. I went to the United Nations Human Rights Convention that year, the first year that the U.S. wasn't on the commission, and received no audience. Neither did all of my friends. Currently, there's 2 Americans that I know of who are being detained in China and suffering severe torture. And I just wanted to know, the Congressman's opinions on how we can approach the issue of international human rights on a unilateral, bilateral, without the United Nations assistance.
Well, I'm familiar with not only this human rights situation, but others in China. I will say that there is reason in the long view to be optimistic about China. The one country, 2 systems policy, as China merges with Hong Kong, gives me reason to be optimistic that the largest nation on the planet is going to liberalize. And again, when I say liberal, I'm talking about Ronald Reagan classical small government individual freedom liberalism. So it may be a twist, but for you political science students, I think you'll catch on. The truth of the matter is, and we were talking about democracy during my talk, Hong Kong has the 2nd highest standard of living on the planet, larger than its mother country, England. It had no democracy for 50 years. What it had was free economic policies. There are some people, Milton Friedman included, that don't really think over the long run you can have free economic policies without free democracy following. China is adopting, in many respects, the Hong Kong economic policy, although it is still very tight. For example, Hillary Clinton just published her book, and they actually edited out in the Chinese texts that are being sold in China a couple paragraphs that were critical of the Chinese government. So China is way beyond the curve. China is a place, by the way, that looks at change. We in America think about the next quarter's profits on Wall Street. We think about the next election cycle. That's the longest worldview we have about things. In China, these folks think in terms of decades or even centuries. And in my view, they are making some progress in terms of liberalizing their media, their individual free rights, but they have a long way to go. But I guess to answer your point with respect to the United Nations, exactly what I was suggesting is what you talked about. You don't need to give all of the power to the United Nations and to cede all the capabilities if you're the United States. As individual matters pop up, for example, the nuclear crisis on the North Korean peninsula right now at Pyongyang, in my view, the United States did the right thing there. The United Nations is going to be irrelevant. What we did is to say, as North Korea was demanding that America negotiate directly with them, what we did is say, no. There are people that have a lot more interest and a lot more things at stake than the United States. So we're going to insist that Japan, that Russia, and especially China be part, and South Korea be part of any negotiations with North Korea. I think you can put together these ad hoc sort of collective security agreements, and when the reason for NATO sort of withers away, I think you rethink it. But clearly, in my view, you can do things on a bilateral basis, as we're doing with trade. We've successfully passed trade agreements with both Singapore and Chile. I think you can put together regional agreements that can protect our interests, but also not submit to an international organization that does, by and large, not share our values.
I just want to add a couple of brief points. The idea of torture in the United States is very horrifying. We cherish our freedoms, our trial by jury, our legal system, and all the protections that are afforded us under the Bill of Rights. And indeed, those human dignity standards are practiced, throughout most of Europe. But the reality is that torture is fairly commonplace. It occurs regularly in China, many other Asian countries, Africa, South America, Central America. And it is something I believe that we in the United States need to do more to come against. And the United Nations, as I alluded to in my comments and Tom alluded to in his comments, is dysfunctional at dealing with this because somewhere close to a majority of the countries that make up the United Nations either sanction and use torture on a regular basis or turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to it. And so how can you look to an institution like the United Nations to try to address something like torture? It really takes, I think, real leadership, and it would take the United States joining with other countries that have a long-standing tradition of standing up for human rights to try to do something about it. And when you have the United Nations Commission on Human Rights being chaired by countries that practice torture, it's no surprise, I think it should come as no surprise, that you got a fairly cold reception when you went there. And certainly I commend you for nonetheless standing up, because that's what it takes.
Thank you very much. Other questions that the panelists can address?
My question is related to, each of you have commented that there aren't necessarily shared values between the United Nations and America, but I kind of wonder about the way that the UN has gone about facilitating elections in different countries. It has an amazing track record for fostering over 80 democratic elections, especially in Cambodia and South Africa. And I just wanted to know if you could comment on that, please.
Before I yield the microphone to my colleague who really tracks these kind of issues pretty nicely, I did start out saying a few kind things about the United Nations, and I neglected this one. They have been engaged in some efforts to monitor elections in some countries.
Yeah, I'm with Dave. I think that the United Nations has done a reasonably good job as we try to help. And these are the kinds of things, along with humanitarian aid, along with having, face-to-face discussions, that I think the United Nations can be very useful at. But when it comes to protecting American security or our geopolitical interests, I think it's been a woeful failure, and that's where I think we put way too much expectations in it.
If I could just add, one of the things that I think that we as a country are not doing enough of is aggressively trying to promote democracy. Now, where we have done that, in some instances we have had problems with that in the past, because in some of these countries the idea of having open elections and electing people. It doesn't work in the cultural and economic system that exists. If you have a country that is essentially a feudal system like you have in Pakistan, you can end up, quote-unquote, electing a body that is essentially dysfunctional. But what we should be doing more of, and we should be promoting more of, is I don't think necessarily having democratic elections. So I think we should promote that, but we should be promoting more is the rule of law, human rights, doing away with torture. We've heard about torture, and as well things like trial by jury, trial by peers. And in particular, if you establish the rule of law, it can go a very, very long way to helping to engender economic prosperity, because it's really impossible to have economic prosperity if you don't have a system where you have the rule of law embedded in it. Another very, very important issue is the issue of women's rights, and we haven't gotten into this sufficiently in this discussion. It was mentioned the 70 Muslim countries. By and large, in the majority of those countries, women are denied the right to vote, the freedom of speech, and I think when you empower women, you frequently tend to see some of these policies like torture go away, and I think that is something that we should be doing more of as a country in our foreign policy and trying to implement it through the United Nations.
Yeah, if I can do a follow-up, because I think Dave raised some really important points. There are two things, and you have to think of and I talked about the relationship between democracy and free capitalism. And some people think over the long run you can't have one without the other, although Hong Kong existed pretty well for 45 years. There are fundamental rights, and Dave talks about the importance of the rule of law, but there are also economic rights, low tax rates. If government's going to take 99% of what you produce, then you're a slave, at least 99% slave. Free trade, which basically is going to improve the quality of your life. The rule of law is very critical. Democracy is a procedural right. And our founding fathers believed, and I believe, if we could find the perfect king and guarantee that every time he had a son or daughter that became king or queen, that they would protect all of my substantive rights, the rule of law, low tax rates, free trade, freedom of speech, all the Bill of Rights, there'd be no reason to go vote. But as Madison said in Federalist 10, since angels do not govern men, we have to have a system of checks and balances, and democracy, as Churchill said, is the worst system except for all the others. So I believe that. It's a very fundamentally flawed system. But I'll close with this. I went to Macedonia 2 years after it became a free nation. And these are very highly educated people. Matter of fact, they had read more economic texts, I'd venture to say, than some economic professors in the United States. They were very capable. 99% of the leaders were former communists, but they had 8 different parties, and they had a constitution that guaranteed everything in the world, including things that were mutually exclusive. But that's neither here nor there. But what I learned that I didn't know and could not have learned without going overseas is that there is, as Dave describes, a culture of democracy. You cannot plop down the American Constitution tomorrow in a society somewhere in the Mideast or in Africa or in Asia. That's why Japan was an extraordinary success, because you changed the culture and it took time. It's why I think Iraq is going to be a lot more difficult than some people think, because democracy is something I literally had to teach members of their newly elected legislative body over there how to have a town meeting. Because when we had a town meeting, it was all of the other congressmen that turned to us and asked questions. And the point was to be responsive to your constituents. Well, these people were communists, and being responsive to their constituents was the last thing in the world. They just couldn't imagine that in America why we would put pictures of our family and our spouses on our campaign literature. They thought that was totally irrelevant and ridiculous. And when we talked about going precinct walking, knocking on doors to explain to voters what your position was, they were horrified. A knock on the door by a government official was never a good thing. And so there's a culture that you have to learn to live with. And finally, one last thing about democracy as a process, because I made a joke about 2 wolves and a lamb deciding on what's for dinner. But look, in America, as recently as 50 years ago in many states in the South, and maybe in some northern states, maybe some places today, if you had said, for example, that an African-American man who was accused of assault or battery by a white woman should be sentenced first and tried second, you might have got a majority of the people in certain communities to support that. The Hitler coming to power in Germany was, in some ways, a democratic, small d, activity. Democracy is a process, and it works to the extent that you guarantee the substantive rights on the other end. That's why we are a constitutional republic and not a direct democracy. Although in California they may be undermining that whole notion right as we speak.
We thank the Congressman, Congressman Weldon, Congressman Feeney, and Congressman Frey.